Welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. In this episode, I am joined by the brilliant Jo Smallwood. Jo is a leadership coach, a leadership thinker, and someone who really gets under the skin of what leaders need to do in this world to be able to engage, develop, create great businesses that run with great people. And I really enjoyed parts of our conversation where we get into this idea of the expectations we put on our leaders, on our managers, and whether they're actually realistic or not. And leaders are so often trying really hard to manage people, often different people with different preferences, and realistically they can't create joy for everyone. And we talk about how it's important that we remember that as individuals we're all accountable for our own joy, and it's not something that somebody else can be responsible for. I had a great time talking to Jo, some really great insight in here, and I hope you enjoy the conversation too. Hello and welcome to the WorkJoy Jam. This week we have Jo Smallwood with us, and I always joke with Jo that she has the surname that everyone thinks my surname is and often calls me, which is Smallwood, and I'm Stallwood. And it's great to have Jo with us today. So I'm going to hand over to Jo. Jo, introduce yourself to everyone and tell us your kind of quick story of how you got to where you are today.
Thanks, Beth. As Beth said, I am the alter ego, the Smallwood to her Stallwood. And we've known each other quite a while now, quite a few years through work. We met through work. And I think probably I don't know if I've ever shared my backstory with you, actually, Beth. So this might be some new stuff for you as well. So I currently work for a leadership development consultancy called Maya, and I've been there quite a few years now, probably getting on for 15 years. But way back in the day when I began working, I was very lucky. I had started working part-time at McDonald's, just to, as all students do. And I was given the opportunity to go on their very first management development program. And it was fantastic. It just took us through every different element of the business and really gave me, at quite a young age, an insight into how big corporations work, where all the moving parts come together. But what I realised was McDonald's are very good at producing McDonald's managers. And I was more interested, I'd sort of got to the stage where I was quite interested in understanding a bit more about leadership and management outside of that McDonald's bubble. So I did a CIPD course and ended up at Vision Express, heading up their learning and development department there. And then a move to Norfolk gave me an opportunity to work in live events, which was fantastic, producing conferences. And it's something that actually I really had enjoyed doing at Vision Express. It was part of the role at Vision Express, so it made sense to then go and do that on a more permanent basis. And then finally, that took me via a friend to Maya. I'd enjoyed working with people backstage, working with understanding what messages they wanted to share, how they were going to, produce the big sort of, what are we trying to tell people here? What are we trying to get them to do? And I'd really enjoyed doing that backstage. And then through a friend, found myself at Maya. And like I say, that was probably 15 years ago. So that's been a whole journey in itself.
Amazing. And it's so lovely to hear your backstory. I think I'd heard bits of it, but not the whole story before. And isn't it interesting how you just take the opportunity that's there when you're young, and it kind of interests you and sparks your interest in a certain area? And had you ever considered working in that world before you were in the McDonald's zone of their management development program?
No, I think probably, the standard route, as we all probably think when we're young and coming out of school, was sort of university, and I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. And this was just a really good opportunity. I think I was quite interested in that they hadn't done anything like that before at McDonald's. And I was with McDonald's for over 10 years, in all. So it was a really good grounding. It was I wouldn't change it for the world, actually.
Brilliant. And tell us a little bit more about your philosophy, your theory, what you think about work joy, how people get it. What's your personal perspective on that?
I was sort of making some notes on this the other day, and it's not as easy to define as you perhaps first think. But I think for me, work joy is about really tapping into that strength, that passion you have for whatever element of your role it is, whatever it is that you're particularly good at. But I think it's not quite as simple as that for me. It's not about just indulging the things that you like about your job or your role, because we all have bits that we like more than others. So it's not about indulging yourself in that respect. It's about making the connection, finding how what you're really good at, what you're passionate about, actually adds value in the bigger picture, to the bigger picture, and how ways of applying what you do well, what you enjoy, what brings you joy, finding new ways to apply it in the role that you're in, or in the organisation that you're in.
Yeah, it's such a good point that you make there. Is it seems like it's about just doing more of one thing, and if you're really good at that, just keep doing it. But actually, we all have to do stuff in our jobs that we don't necessarily enjoy, that we're not necessarily that connected
Mm,
to, or that we just find a bit dull or a bit
yeah,
boring. And I think those things exist in every job, whether you work for yourself, whether you work in a big corporation, whether you work in a small organization or a charity. There's always going to be some bits of it that you're not going to find that joyful,
yeah,
because I'm not convinced there is 100% work joy out there. And for me, I really like what you're saying there. It's about finding the bits and seeing where else you can apply them, and
yeah,
seeing how you can maybe multiply that in different areas or different thinking or different projects
yeah, yeah.
to get more of it and do more of what you're really good at and where your passion lies. So tell me a bit more about strengths and passion, and how when they come together, that can be a really important thing, but also sometimes they can be separate as well.
They can, and I think because we probably don't do enough analysis of this. And by analysis, I don't mean sort of unpicking and unpacking everything, but we probably don't spend enough time reflecting on what it is that we enjoy about our job, and what it is, to your point, what it is that we don't enjoy about our job. I'm with you. I don't think any role is going to be pure joy, but I'm also of the opinion I don't think it should be. I think there's a bit of that sort of light and dark going on here, isn't there? Where I think you can um, enjoy things because they are not constant. You have to sort of put in a few, a bit of the hard yards to get to the bits that you really, really like. So I think there's a bit of that, reflecting on achievements, reflecting on the work that you've put in. I think it is, and I think it's about bringing in different elements of your strength and your passion, and knowing when. We've been talking a lot lately, Beth, with clients, particularly in coaching conversations, about tapping into new resources, because it's been such a difficult time for people. But really knowing when to dial up some of those strengths, but also when to dial them back. And we use a product at Maya called StrengthScope. It's a psychometric tool, but they have a great phrase about strengths in overdrive. And I think what we sometimes see is people overplaying their strengths and scaling up their passion to a point where it means other people don't have a way in, don't have a way. It makes collaboration very difficult at that stage. So I think it's about being mindful about the level at which your strengths and passion are at their optimum.
It's such a good point. And just going back a little bit, one of the things I really liked about what you said there was around sometimes you need the light and dark to be able to feel the light and to feel the joy. And that sometimes the things that eventually bring us some joy are the things that we've put really hard work into.
Yeah, yeah,
And the hard work can feel difficult and challenging and at points annoying, but actually it's what leads us to a better result. It's what leads us to the feeling of achievement, and that joyful moment wouldn't have existed if the hard bits weren't there. So it's
exactly.
about appreciating, and I hate this word because it's so overused, but the journey towards some of that
Yeah,
joy as well as the actual moment of joy.
yeah,
And this
yeah,
idea about strengths in overdrive is really interesting as well, and how we sometimes, I'll give you an example, being totally out there, is one of my strengths is that I'm quite a positive person. I tend to find the joy, I tend to find the way through and the answer and a solution. But sometimes people need me to dial that back and sit and just listen to what's actually wrong versus trying to always be upbeat.
yeah,
And sometimes people find that quite hard if it's too much.
yeah, yeah. I agree, and I think I think it's something that I think what I've learned through this period that we're continuing to live through at the moment um, is where people have referenced joy in its most obvious sense is where they have come together in unexpected ways with colleagues, with other people in the business, where they've been given an opportunity to really pull in the same direction. And I think there was a period right at the start of the crisis that people reference a lot about that sort of, Dunkirk spirit, where we all had to sort of pull together. And people really sort of looked back on those moments where the direction felt clear. They knew what they were doing. They knew the value they were adding. They saw they saw the results of their efforts. But I think it was that, and it was a joined up. It was a joint, sort of effort that created the end result. And I think people have. I think since then people have sort of been trying to recapture some of that. I think it is that, seeing your strengths aligned with other people's strengths and passions as well, where some of this really begins to sort of accumulate and create that moment of joy as you're describing it.
And it's so interesting because I've been hearing similar things about that. Actually, responding to the crisis initially, there was that let's bring it together,
Mm,
let's
mm.
make it happen. And it's really hard to replicate that when there isn't a crisis.
Yeah,
When
yeah,
then the crisis in the world that we live in the UK has become kind of into the new business as usual, business
yeah,
as
yeah.
normal. And it's not so easy to get that spirit when we're not suddenly trying to find out how does everybody suddenly work from home, or when we're in it now and
Mm,
it's kind of an ongoing drudge through lockdown, not lockdown, restrictions, different tiers,
yeah,
what's going
yeah.
on here, how are we going to work from home, work from the office. And that's a really tough thing for leaders to manage, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, we've been writing blogs since the beginning of lockdown, just because we had access to so many different clients who were sharing so many different stories. But in all of those, there were elements that crossed over. There were common themes that were emerging, and we felt it was important to sort of capture those somewhere and in some way. Um, and you're right. That the latest blog we've written, which goes out today, is on fatigue and how sort of, I suppose, just empty. How empty the tank is for a lot of people. They've had to work in very reactive ways. They've had to, really pull on sort of, you know, different parts of their personality that perhaps they didn't even know they had. They've certainly had to apply themselves in such different ways. Teams have had to work differently. There is the remote element as well, which adds complexity to everything. And yeah, it has taken its toll, and we haven't been able to replenish our energy in the way that we normally would. We haven't been able to go out for meals and drinks with friends, and we haven't always been able to go to the gym, and we haven't always been able to do what we need to do to sort of recharge. And I think, that sense of fatigue, I think we're coming to the end of the year. I think there's still a huge amount of uncertainty. And I think it's beginning to show. And obviously that's where we need to re-find those points of joy. I think that's where it becomes even more important that we know where to go to in our role for that joy, that gives us that that much needed boost in our day.
And I'm just reflecting on, this time last year, in the run up to the end of the year. I think that fatigue is normal actually at this time. It is one of those things
Yeah.
at the end of the year, you do feel people needing a break, needing to do it. It's just that it's almost under a magnifying glass now how
Yeah.
much more people need it. And, there's so many stories out there of people who haven't taken their holidays because you're not really going on holiday. They haven't taken a rest break. You're not getting out there to do the things that would normally recharge you. And the festive season in 2020 is going to look very different for most people as to how it has done previously. So it's a really interesting point about how do we find the joy even when we can't do the things that we would usually do. And we might need to do some work on what are the things that can bring us joy within the situation we're in versus hankering after some joy that we know we can't have,
Yeah.
because that's like unrequited joy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't have it. You and I cannot meet up right now and go for a coffee and have a chat. It's just not allowed.
Yeah.
So how do we find the small bits of joy within those restrictions?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I know in a lot of coaching conversations that I've had recently, I think where people have been trying to reclaim that time that they need, they've been talking about, how do I carve out space in my diary to be able to sort of give real sort of proper thinking time to some of the big issues that are going on. How do I re-energize? And I think people have been looking for those really big chunks of time. How do I get half a day to do this? How do I make sure my diary has a day a month to for reading or whatever it is. And a lot of the conversation has come back to, perhaps don't look for half a day, perhaps look for 15 minutes, look for 10 minutes. And I think that applies to the joy as well, don't you? Where perhaps we're looking for the big, the big obvious points that bring us joy and happiness in our day, when really we might be better just trying to look for the smaller version of it, that those what seem insignificant, but when you reflect back on it, were really good parts of the day. They might be sort of 10-15 minutes long. So I think it's about, as you say, not trying to find the big bells and whistles versions of everything at the minute, but really looking, really being critical and looking at the small elements that come together to bring us joy.
Definitely. And I think it's in line with, if you think about how much people's worlds have shrunk over the last year,
Yeah.
like the world, our worlds have become a lot smaller. I think we need to do the same thing with our expectations of ourselves and probably our
Yeah.
expectations of joy, and to think about, actually, if I can get 5 mini bits of joy in a day, that's really good. Or even one, just you just start small and then grow it from there. But
Yeah.
it's even that time spent, talking, people want time to spend thinking about the big things. I would really advise everyone to spend some time thinking about themselves as well, and putting themselves on their to-do list, especially, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, and when you're in a leadership position and the requirements and expectations of you as a person means that you're giving a lot of your
Yeah.
time and your energy and your effort and your emotions and your empathy to the people who you lead.
Yeah.
Is that so many leaders I speak to, they don't exist on their to-do list anywhere, and then
No.
that makes their tank empty and they're running on empty, and that then actually doesn't help them be a great leader, because when you haven't got any reserves in you, leading with empathy, leading with, kindness, and all the things that people need at this time
Yeah.
become a lot harder, because we all
Yeah,
know
they
that
do.
when we're running on empty, we're a bit more snappy, we're a
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
more we have less patience, we
Yeah.
have less creativity in our thinking.
Yeah.
So there's something for me about how do we do that. And yeah, the smaller things, and giving yourself permission to give yourself some time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think, again, sort of self-care and well-being and, and all of those sort of check-in points that we've been talking about, you're absolutely right. We've seen the impact that's had on leaders firsthand. And as you say, if we're not feeling strong ourselves, it's very difficult to be strong for other people. And we're not saying you have to fix things for other people. That's absolutely not your role as leader. But I think what is evident, as you say, is when we are feeling low, running low on energy, we react differently, we respond differently, and it's not always positively, as you say. So yeah, it's a big deal at the moment that we take time out to really think about how we look after ourselves during each and every single day that we have to give to our teams. We have to also replenish that somewhere, and I don't think we're doing enough of that.
Totally. And let's move on to kind of the subject of leaders in a bit more detail, because one of the things that I think can bring people enormous joy is working with a leader who is inspiring, gets them, understands them, has empathy, all of the things that if you were to look up a book on leadership, you go, yes, that's everything I want in a
Yeah.
leader. That's really exciting. But also that leaders can be a source of, like, the opposite of joy, the gloomies, the things that actually really get you down.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm really always really interested in is that people hold a lot of expectations about what their bosses can do for them. And I'm not always sure that those expectations are particularly realistic. And I work under the banner usually that we need to remember that leaders are human beings as well, and that they're trying, and most of them that I work with are trying to do their best, and they're struggling like all humans do, and they're finding some of this stuff hard. And I'd just be really interested to know in your thoughts around, actually, when you're working with leaders, because that is your specialist subject, helping them, what is some of the guidance and advice you would give about being a leader who can help people feel the joy, but also empowering people to actually do some of the stuff themselves rather than relying entirely on their boss or their leader, their manager, to be able to do it for them?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think, I know we keep going back to sort of the pandemic, but I think it has made leaders look at themselves differently, and I think it's made teams look at their leaders differently. I think we're coming into an era where, as you say, we've often spoke about leader as coach, and and things like that. But I think, as you say, there's a next level of empathy that's needed at this moment in time, and I think the leaders that have responded well to that, I have to say, are the ones that have shared some of their own vulnerabilities. It's, as you say, they are human too, and to think about how, where leaders have really had greatest impact. I think the ones that we've been working with are the ones that have had the bravery to say, do you know what, I'm not dealing with this very well either. I don't know how this is going to turn out. And that's a very difficult place for leaders to put themselves, because, you say, we've always sort of secretly felt that they should be sort of infallible to a certain extent. And I think because there is that sense of nobody's been through this before, this is new to everyone. I think we've had to sort of lay bare some of the areas that we're less confident in as leaders. I think we've had to share that with our teams, And I think those leaders that have done that have had teams that have responded remarkably well. And I think, they have come out a stronger leader for it.
And it's in some ways the next stage of where things were heading in leadership guidance anyway, isn't it? Because empathy has been a big point, and
Yeah.
coaching and developing people and having that positive relationship and not being in that kind of command and control
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
managers of your and it's interesting because I think in some ways this could be, and again I'll put my positive hat on here, this could be one of the best things that comes out of pandemic is more leaders who are open, more empathetic, able to understand and care for others, able to be vulnerable and show that they're human too, and to gather people together to work on a solution rather than just assuming they have all the answers. But that's a tough change, isn't it, in terms of some leaders and how they have been to how things are now.
It's huge. And I think one of the things that we're working on with a particular client, one of their values is kindness, which I think is an amazing value to have. And, one of the things, again, that has come out of the crisis is people have had to reevaluate, reinterpret their values as an organization. But I think that the client that springs to mind here when you speak about that, Beth, is one that, there is a danger that we can, going back to our, over dialing up strengths too much, there is a danger that we can go too far down the I'm going to be empathetic, I'm going to be understanding route. Of course, we have to have all of those things as leaders, but the client we're working with, one of the clients we're working with at the moment, is talking about how they match levels of kindness with accountability, because we are still operating a fully functioning business, and one that's having to navigate incredibly challenging landscapes. So it is this understanding as leaders that we have to have a balance as well. We can be kind, we can be respectful, we can be empathetic, but in all of that, we also have to recognise where people are accountable, where we can engineer a bit of stretch for them, where we can introduce new things into their role that perhaps challenge them a bit more, but also grow, help them to grow. So I think we have to think carefully about not overplaying empathy too much as well. It should absolutely feature, and as you say, this is a next generation of leadership that we're going to be looking at. But I think my fear is that it would be easy to go too far, and then we're missing that real sort of that real role that we have as leaders in terms of developing and nurturing talent, but also, sort of shared ownership and shared responsibility for the success of the organisation.
Definitely, and it's such a fine line, and you're really making me think of Kim Scott and her book Radical Candor, about the quadrant that she talks about, which is ruinous empathy, which is so much empathy that you don't get anything done, and you actually end up not helping a person in their job because you're being so kind and you've gone so far down the empathy route that you're no longer giving them any challenge or any growth potential. So definitely one to think, and this is where I think leadership becomes even harder in the next generation. And I know we're always looking for ways to make it easy for people to be good leaders, but actually leadership is hard. And if you're in those kind of roles, and if you're looking up to leaders, I think there's something we need to understand is it's such a fine tightrope of going too far one way, too far the other way, trying to balance everything and trying to work often with many, many people who all have slightly different preferences, slightly different needs, slightly different levels of skills and strengths and all of those different things. And trying to be all things to all of your team is a tough gig.
Yeah, it is. And that's the point where you lose your own authenticity as a leader as well. But I think also, I mean, if we take it back to joy for a moment, it makes me think, listening to that, there's something for me about, we always tell leaders, your role is not to provide all the answers, fix the problem. That's absolutely the opposite. You need to be getting people to find their own solutions. And I think for me, as leaders, it's not our job to help people find their work joy either. It's there, only I know what brings me joy in my role, and only I can sort of only I should be responsible for making that part of my priority. And I think as managers, if we go too far down that ruinous empathy route, we will end up trying to identify joy for others when really, that's their journey to take, not ours.
Definitely. And we would always come, wouldn't it, from, if you're a leader in that position, you come from what brings you joy.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
brings you joy is never going to be what brings someone else joy. It's so individual. It's so based on all of the different things in your life, not just work. And I don't think you could create joy. I think, on the other hand, what you can do is you can try and avoid creating the opposite of joy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
You're right.
perhaps a leader's role in the future when it comes to joy is about creating a zone of neutrality where people can build joy from, versus a zone of negativity. And it's very hard to go from the opposite of joy to joy in one step. Whereas if you're going from actually everything's just okay, I can build joy from here, it's much easier to do that.
Yeah. 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 And I think it is a really good point that we try. I think sometimes we expect things to happen easily and quickly, and there is, again, we talk a lot with leaders and teams about the need to just test things out, try things out, give it a go, see what happens. I think before this we had got to a point where it was very difficult to do that because failure was such a difficult thing to manage, and something to be avoided. And I know it's very easy to talk about failure as growth and failing forward and all the great sort of phrases that sit around it, the business phrases that sit around it. But in practice, it is hard in business to fail and then to sort of pick up the pieces and learn from it. We don't always have that environment or that time to be able to do that. But I think there is something about, as you say, when we're looking for those points of joy in our roles, in our responsibilities, it is about giving things a go, because I think also we will all have unidentified joy as well, things that we had no idea brought us such pleasure and such a sense of achievement. And so I think it's about finding new points of joy as well.
And not just assuming that we know all those things already, right? Because
Exactly. Exactly.
no one in the world has tried everything yet. There's
No.
nobody who's tried everything. And what some people might find is that actually they get a point of joy from something outside of work that helps
Yeah.
them feel better when they're at work anyway. So, we talked about things like, people doing stuff outside of work that brings them joy. So, is it that going for a dog walk in the morning will set you up to have a really good
Mm.
day, and that gives you enough joy for the day, even if what you're doing isn't actually giving you that level of excitement and joy on that day? Is it that, you're someone who's really into yoga, or you're really into having a Zoom quiz on a Saturday night that just makes all of the joy happen? Sometimes it's about joy in your life as well as joy at work, and having the balance between some of those things. And, giving
Yeah.
stuff a go is such a good way of thinking about it, because giving stuff a go doesn't commit you to being a lifelong commitment to it. It just makes you say, I tried it. Did I like it? No, I'm not going to do it again. And I
Yeah.
just thinking back to a couple of years ago, a friend bought me a present for my birthday that was to go and do some pottery. And I have to tell you, I was totally rubbish at it, but it gave me immense amounts of joy. So, when you think, actually, sometimes we think it's about being good at stuff that gives us joy. Sometimes it's just the process of doing it.
Yeah.
Like, you get to be messy, and people, like, you have all this mud up your arms, and it's like, oh, hang on a minute, this is fun. And you get to be practical with stuff. For me, that gave me loads and loads of joy, but I didn't have to be good at it. And in my head, for so long, you only got joy from things that you're good at. And that really kind of turned it round for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a good point. That it's not just finding your joy; it's also finding your level of joy. Um, and that concept of I have to be good at it to enjoy it. We just have to enjoy it, don't we? We don't have to be brilliant at something, and I think we have this need to sort of jump into things and instantly be brilliant or instantly be an expert or instantly it is the it is the modern world, isn't it? This sort of instant gratification that we're all becoming more and more familiar with. And I think sometimes, the process of building up our knowledge, our skills, the process of connecting with different people in a different way, all of that sort of come together to sort of give us this end picture that we can reflect back on. And I think in the moment it's sometimes hard to recognize those as those little pieces that are going to make this great picture in the end. But I think it is important for leaders to keep encouraging, keep letting people have a go at things, and part of that, as we know, is creating that safe space to do that. And we've done a lot of work over the past weeks with teams where we've really drilled into what it means to have a safe space, to be able to bring back small wins, issues, problems, things that didn't go well. There has to be that space somewhere for us to all come together and share our stories from the week. And I think that is probably one of the most important roles as leader at the minute, to be able to enable that for people.
Definitely, and share your stories without the judgment on them. It's like,
Yes,
actually,
yeah,
this is it's so easy, isn't it, for our brains to
yeah,
go into judgment zone of, well, you didn't do that very well, or that was really great. But actually just creating a zone for people to say it as it is and
yeah,
be okay with that.
yeah. And we've actually spoke recently, very recently. It's one of the, if you can make it work, it's one of the benefits of working remotely. It's very difficult to jump in when you're on screen. A lot of these platforms only allow for one person to talk at one time, which means everyone else is listening. For the first time, they are really listening. And so they're not trying to suggest a way forward. They're not trying to, as you say, share their opinion of why that didn't work or why it would work better if you did it differently. They're having to focus on the screen. They're having to focus on what you're saying. They're having to listen to what their colleagues are sharing. And I think it has been one of the side effects of having to work like this that has really, really brought out another level of sharing as teams.
Definitely. And it's really interesting. I remember early on in the pandemic when everyone was kind of moving on to online, and being in some conversations and things where for the first time people and leaders especially were talking about, their family, and you were seeing their life beyond
Yeah.
work. And it's opened up, I think, a more full human approach to how we see people at work, and not just what they're like when they come into an office or what they like when they come into their place of work, which,
Mm.
lots of people don't work in offices, and lots of people are at work doing jobs now in person. So there's so many different ways of looking at it, but I totally agree. There are some benefits to doing things online. There are some benefits to having that space. The challenge for me is always, are people actually listening, or are they doing their emails or something else at the same time? So it's about how do we focus that attention as well as
Yeah,
utilizing it.
that's very cynical. I will say we haven't had any instances of that, Beth Stallwood.
Oh, well done.
No, we have genuinely had teams for whom I think there's something about, obviously the work we do is so important, especially in these times, because we're almost giving people time to pause, time to
Yeah.
just regroup, reset, reframe. Um, and it's all done in a very sort of carefully crafted, facilitated manner. So it just opens up the conversations that, rightly or wrongly, we all say we don't have time for that in the normal day to day. So this oasis that we can create for teams. And I think that's why people haven't been multitasking in the background. They've relished that time together to just take a moment out and think, do you know what, we've worked really hard and we've had some great results, but now we need to focus on this. And it's just been, it's, we were talking about joy. It has genuinely been a joy to be part of.
Great. And there's things to be learned from that, isn't there, as well? I love your term there, like create a little oasis where people can have those conversations. Is, as leaders out there listening right now, if you can create an hour a week where you do that and you replicate that and everyone comes together and you share some stories in a really lovely safe space, you will be creating joy for people.
Yeah. And for yourself. Yeah, definitely.
Amazing. I'm just thinking about something you said a little bit earlier about, finding that space to experiment, to let people try new things, and that this balance that I think is out there. And this is the one of the challenge of the tightrope of leadership is you want people to be able to fail, because failure is where innovation happens and where you get growth and all the great things. But you want people to be able to go through that process and your business to still be successful.
Yeah.
So you're trying to balance those two things. And one of the things, again, I wonder about is like the micro experiments, the micro failures, the little things that won't make a massive difference, but where it brings you that experience of going through the process of failure and understanding how your resilience is there and understanding what it teaches you. But with the balance of, this isn't going to cripple our business for the next 5 years in a difficult time when we're already struggling.
Yeah.
So it's one of the small things that people can be challenged on, that they're kind of safe to fail.
Yeah.
Way of thinking. And I think there's always some things you can work out there. But again, all of these things just take a little bit more thinking than the obvious.
Yeah, they do.
And it's that time to think.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there for me, Beth. I think one is, you're absolutely right. We have to find ways to fail safely. But I think one of the worst things we can do as leaders is create pretend projects, pretend failures. If we're going to really learn from this, it has to have some value in the process. We can't do something that is hypothetical on the sideline, because we're not going to really learn from that. And so don't make something up just for someone to be able to have a practice. Give them something real to get hold of and try. And in the whole scheme of things, when even if we look for things to try that are on a slightly bigger scale, very rarely what we do will be catastrophic to the business. It might cause a bump in the road that we weren't anticipating, or we're not looking forward to dealing with. But ultimately, it's probably not going to be catastrophic even in these strange times. So I think it's keeping things in perspective as well.
Yeah.
And you said at the
definitely.
start, yeah, we haven't been able to recreate that moment of crisis where we all come together. Well, actually, sometimes when things don't go right, that is when we come together.
Yeah, that is true. And I think you're right. People know when something's fake, and they don't engage with it as well as when it's something real. If you know that actually it's fake, and therefore if you fail, there's no problem, you're not really putting your whole heart into it, are you?
No, there's a big old safety net underneath you, and actually there should be some sort of safety net. There should be some way of, there should be some obvious exit strategies if things are getting a little bit too hot to handle, if you're trying things out. But if it's if it's not real, then actually you don't get the benefit of understanding what that failure means, but also you don't get the benefit of seeing the achievement if you get it right, because it just has no value add. It has no context in what we're trying to do as an organization. So it has to be something that matters.
Yeah. Right. We're coming towards the end. I've got a few questions for you. Are you okay for me to quick fire them at you?
You can quick fire them at me. I can't promise I will quick fire back, but I will. I will endeavour to
You
do
take
so.
as long as you need.
Oh, good.
So, question 1 from me is, for you personally as an individual, what is always guaranteed to bring you some work joy?
WorkJoy for me? I think I feel very privileged as a coach to be able to have some amazing conversations with some amazing people. And I never come out of a coaching session not having learned something, not having shared some really fantastic moment with the coachee or whoever I'm chatting to. And I think what I've learned more and more is, these conversations that we're having now have such relevance and such importance to how people are then continuing the rest of their day, the rest of their week. And actually, just the ad hoc conversations that sometimes spring up during the week. You and I regularly catch up. I try to plan time in my diary to sort of just have what we're calling virtual coffees with people that have no agenda, no purpose. It's just checking in. But I can almost guarantee I leave those conversations feeling that I've taken something from them, and something very, very insightful, something very important, and it does bring me joy.
So again, it's making time for those conversations as well, isn't it? And the
Yeah,
ones without an agenda, without a business purpose. And humans need that connection, and being able to have a great conversation with somebody can
yeah.
bring you such joy. So wonderful to hear that. What book are you currently reading?
Being part of your book group, I should say the book that that
Say
we
the honest truth, Jo, here. Come
have on
on.
the agenda. So it's not that one. It's Think Like a Monk by Jay Shetty.
And how are you finding it?
It is. It is a fascinating. His is a fascinating story. If you don't know about him, he dropped out of. He was working in the city. He'd always sort of been connected to his spiritual side, but he dropped out of the city and went to be a monk for 4 years. And then, by mutual agreement, that was never going to be his life story. So he then, but he's now applying some of those monk-like disciplines to sort of helping leaders and helping anybody who cares to read about him. And it's just fascinating. It's just fascinating his approach to values, and actually just sort of, really, really taking on a different perspective, I suppose. So yeah, good. It's
Great.
good.
I think I might have to get that on the book read list. Next question from me. What's the best or most useful bit of advice that you've had in your life that you always come back to?
Actually, there's probably two, and they're probably from the same source. So they're from Greg McKeown, who wrote The Essentialist, and they have both been learnings since lockdown for me. So the first one is, if you don't prioritize your time, someone else will. And I think we are a little bit laissez-faire with our diaries, and we let people put meetings in, and we let people sort of carve out big chunks of space, when actually we don't always really challenge if that amount of time is needed, or if we're needed on that meeting, or what our role is at that meeting. So I think there's something about prioritizing your time and not letting others dictate it. But the other piece of advice I took from his book was how important it is to protect the asset. The asset being you. How many, and it comes back to what we were saying earlier about how much time do we allow in the day to really look after ourselves, to apply a bit of self-care. And if you don't protect the asset, eventually cracks will begin to show, and we will not be performing in the way that we want, or others expect. So I think that was a real moment of clarity when I read that.
Such a good bit of advice there. And to think of yourself as the asset is, it probably seems a bit strange for people, but it's so true in business that you are actually quite important there. And how do you look after yourself in the right way? And the thing about the diary is great advice, because it's so true. If you don't control it, someone else will.
Yeah.
And they will not control it in the way that you would want it to be
Absolutely
controlled.
not. Absolutely not.
Okay. Nearly final question from me is, what is one super practical bit of advice that you would give to our listeners that they could go and do right now, really simple, do tomorrow, do the next day, build as a habit, that would help bring them some work joy in their lives?
I think we've been doing this with teams recently in different workshops that we've been doing, but I think there's something about either doing a check-in every morning with yourself or a check-out every evening. You do both if you want, but I think there's something about checking in the morning, just saying, okay, where am I today? How am I feeling? How are my energy levels? Because if we do that moment of check-in in the morning, it means we take on the day differently. So if we've got things during the day that we know are going to bring us a huge amount of pleasure, we can prioritize those. If we're not feeling great, we can think, okay, well, that's the bit that I'm really going to enjoy today. I'm going to make space for, and I'm going to really, invest in. And if we're feeling okay and particularly strong, then suddenly you think, yeah, I can take on, there's something today that, has been hanging around. It's been on my to-do list for a while. So I think checking in with yourself, being honest and being okay. If your check-in in the morning is, I'm not feeling it today, I'm not feeling that great, that's okay. And it just means that you allow yourself a different perspective when you take on some of the tasks. And I think alongside that, something I read the other day, and I can't for the life of me remember where it was, but they were talking about to-do lists, which I love. I love a good to-do list. But they were saying that there should be a list at the side of it, which is not to do, but to be. So I'm going to do these things, but in doing them, I'm going to be this. So I'm going to be calm. I'm going to be mindful. I'm going to be curious. And I think that just adds a whole new dimension to your day.
So it's kind of setting your intention for your attitude towards the to-do list and your behaviours
Yeah,
towards the to-do list, as well as the actual practical to-do list.
Yeah. If you've got some tricky things on the to-do list, your to be might frame those. So if you've got a difficult conversation to have, it might be to be patient, to listen more, to be an active listener. It's sort of like you say, it sets your intention. It gives you a dimension against which to do the task. And perhaps we don't give enough thought to that. So I would say my piece of advice is check in with yourself either morning or evening, and just have a moment to think where you're at, and add to be to your to-dos.
Love that advice. I think I'm going to start thinking about that one. And even if it was something like to be kind to yourself while you're doing your to-do list, you could really build in that self-care as well as the things that other people need from you as well.
Yeah.
Great advice. Thank you, Jo, for sharing all of your thoughts, your insight from what you're learning in your role and your background. And it's been amazing to have a conversation with you. Where can our listeners find out more about you and your organisation and your thinking?
So Maya has a website, www.maya.uk. That's probably as good a starting place as any. We share all our blogs and all what we do about us, who we are, all on there. But there's also a page at the end, which is news and insights, which is what we're up to. That's where all our blogs are. And, they make for a fantastic, I'm not just saying it, obviously I'm biased, but they make for an amazing read, because we've kept this sort of blog piece up throughout the whole of lockdown, and it just reflects where people have been on this journey and continue. And obviously we've had great access to some fantastic chief execs and their teams, all of whom have been very open and honest in sharing their own experiences and how they're feeling about all of this. So well worth a sort of a little meander through those if you've got time. So they're on our website, but they're also shared on LinkedIn, and I can be found on LinkedIn if people want to contact me.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jo. I'm looking forward to our regular catch-ups. They always bring me lots of joy. Thank you for taking part in the WorkJoy Jam.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the WorkJoy Jam with our fantastic guest, Jo Smallwood. There are so many little bits of advice and nuggets of brilliance I'm going to take away, but a couple that I'm really thinking about after that conversation is around the leader's role. And if you are a leader, if you're a manager, if you're somebody out there responsible for other people, is this idea of creating a little oasis for how the team come together, talk and share that reality in a really open, able to be vulnerable, able to say if it's not great kind of a way. So that one for me has really stuck with me. And the other one is when Jo talked about where she's hearing people reference joy, and she's talked about it in its most obvious sense, is often where people have come together, perhaps even in unexpected ways. So maybe that's something for us all to think about, is how do we come together in those unexpected ways as a way of creating some more joy. Thank you so much for listening to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. You can find out more about WorkJoy on our website, which is createworkjoy.com. We're also on the Instagram, which is @createworkjoy. And we'd love to hear from you, hear your thoughts on the podcast, hear what you're doing, what actions you're taking as a result. So do tag us and tell us and show us what you're up to. Thank you for listening.